Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. The subject this morning is worship as a spiritual practice. And we'll do it in two parts. We'll have part one today and a part two next week. So today we will see the purpose of worship. In Sanskrit it's called puja, the purpose of puja and how we benefit from it. And next week we will see the basic laws of puja, what are the governing laws of worship and its general framework. Many of you have been attending the worship that we have at the Vedanta Center throughout the year, and it's helpful to understand what exactly is happening. I mean, it does, many have said over the years how they feel uplifted and the atmosphere that is generated when a worship is being done. But when we understand exactly what is happening, what are beyond the visuals and the hearing of the chanting of the mantras, if we understand what is happening, so it will give us a better idea of how not just the one who is doing puja, but one who is participating. What does participation in a puja mean? And that we will see next Sunday. So we have seen that not last week, a week before last, when the topic for satsang was prayer as a spiritual practice. And in that context, we saw how prayer is primarily a form of receiving from the divine. It's a form of asking what we need from a superhuman source, if you like. And when we receive what we asked for, we say the prayers are answered. So if prayer is a form of asking, then worship, as I briefly mentioned that time, is a form of giving. Now, prayer itself, when it becomes really very intense, because prayer usually involves words, whether we utter them vocally or not, even if it's a silent prayer, still there is some language involved. We are asking for something. There are words involved. But when prayer becomes very intense, very deep, then we go beyond words. And in that very intense form of prayer, itself gets transformed into meditation. So prayer itself, when it becomes intense, can be a meditation. But that level of intensity or that depth of intensity is not very easily accomplished by most people. And that is why worship is what provides the intermediate step between prayer and meditation. We find the hint of this progression of prayer, worship, and meditation in many different ways, in many different traditions. Although the word themselves may be used, different words may be used, but the idea of a movement from the divine to the devotee, a movement from the devotee towards the divine, and eventually the two coming together, the creator and the creature, the divine and the human coming together. And when that meeting takes place, that is the culmination of spiritual experience. We find a hint of this progression in the Sermon on the Mount, in the three key words, ask, seek, and knock. We read in Matthew, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. It's possible to look at this three things that is occurring, asking, seeking, and knocking, in terms of this prayer, worship, and meditation. We find it as well in the way the, the Vedic books are arranged. We saw this also last time we spoke about prayer, how when the Vedic insights were at some point by this great teacher, today we know as Vyasa. He compiled and rearranged the Vedic material in 4 books. The different sections, they again correspond to what today we might roughly call as prayer, worship, and meditation. The first part of the Vedas are called the Samhitas, which are essentially devotional prayers and hymns addressed to these divine figures. The second section of the Vedas are called the Brahmanas, which really delineate the way worship is being done, the Vedic forms of worship were being done. The third section, Aranyaka, also has worship, but the same worship which can also be done mentally. So there are lots of these meditations, they are called vidyas in the Vedas, of how these worship can be internalized. And so the Aranyakas can be seen as a representing meditation. And then you come to the Upanishads, which primarily describe the highest experience that comes as a result of these practices. Even in the Eightfold Path of Patanjali, we find the steps 5, 6, and 7 are called Pratyahara, Dharana, and Dhyana. And even these 3 steps correspond roughly to these 3 ways we are calling in the language of devotion, prayer, worship, and meditation. Pratyahara is a way of bringing all the forces of the mind together, which is what prayer can often do. Prayer has this great ability, since we are asking something, we are formulating our needs in the words. It brings together, it's easier. Sometimes people, when they meditate, they find the mind getting distracted. But when you are asking something from someone in a language that makes sense, then of course it's very difficult to get distracted, otherwise your words won't come out right. And so prayer accomplishes this 5th step of pratyahara more naturally and effortlessly. And then intensification of that, bringing together the parts of the mind, is done through worship. Again, when we are sitting to do worship, and every form of worship has certain methodology attached to it. There are certain ways of doing things, certain mantras to be chanted along. Again, that helps to preclude the possibility of distractions coming in. And so that's how the dharana, and then finally dhyana will be that meditation itself. And finally, the state of samadhi, the 8th step, is really that deepest absorption in which one experiences the presence of the divine. In St. Ignatius, based his spiritual exercises also on this idea. Man is created for this end, to praise, renounce, and serve the Lord his God. We find this progression of how the mind can slowly come together, go deeper into the divine, and ultimately experience the presence of the divine. So there is the practice that many people do today, especially in Vedanta. It's called upasana. Now, upasana is as a method of spiritual practice has been developed over centuries, and that upasana combines all the prayer, worship, and meditation parts into one composite discipline. Literally, the word upasana comes from the prefix upa, means near. Asana means sitting. So literally, upasana means sitting near. And it means sitting in the presence of the divine. So whether we are doing prayer or worship or meditation, whichever way we might want to classify our spiritual practice, what is most important in that is to recognize that we are sitting in the presence of the divine. Whether I am praying to God or worshiping God or meditating on God, if I think of God as some unknown, distant presence, then none of these things can be accomplished perfectly. In order for prayer, worship, and meditation to succeed, to, to, to yield the kind of result we expect them to yield, it's very important to recognize that the divine, God, is very close, very near. And that's why upasana means being near, sitting near. So, what is the general nature of worship? What are the characteristics? Now, worship, although I'm kind of using a very generic term, it's good to recognize that the way puja is done is there is no one universal way to do it. Worship takes many different forms in many different traditions. And so there isn't just one way of doing it. But all of these different ways of worshipping, they share a common characteristic. There are certain things common, irrespective of which different forms of worship we be a part of. So the first characteristic of worship is sacrifice, is offering. But we have seen this briefly again previously. It is called yajna in Sanskrit. We also saw a very detailed description of it in the Wednesday Gita class. So yajna primarily involves giving without expecting any kind of return. And we give without expecting return because in yajna, it is an acknowledgement that I am giving not what is mine, but simply what I have received. And if we just look back at on our life itself, anyone's life, we look at our lives and we find that there is so much we have received from the world, right from the moment we were born. Clearly, of course, the physical requirement of air, water, and food, it has come to us through oftentimes, of course, when we were born, there's almost nothing we could do on our own. So those who raised us, our parents and the other elders in the family, they fed us, they took care of us. And so all of that, not just the material things that we got from them, but also love, understanding, friendship. And as we grow up, we make friends, we see an extended family, we go to school, our teachers, all of these people at different stages of life who have become parts of our life, they have given us in so many different ways. So many a times people like to think in terms of, oh, I didn't receive any help, I just did everything on my own. But if you think a little deeply, there's already so many people have contributed to make every one of us who we are at present. And so we have already received a lot from the world. And worship, one of the first acts of worship is offering. So the world gives me so many things. Now, if I just say, oh, I'm going to receive everything, I'm not going to give anything to anyone, then things go wrong. And participating in this kind of a cosmic movement, the world, universal life giving me things, and then through me, they are going out again. So I receive love from the world. I love other people because then I'm like passing it on. I receive friendship. I return through friendship. Again, if we can to the same people, of course, that's great. But sometimes it may not be possible to give back to the people what they gave us. But then we just pass it on, just like they did to us. So that is the process of yajna. In these ancient texts, they mention 5 basic forms of yajnas. So yajna, as I said, is a form of giving, but without expecting anything back. So the 5 kind of yajnas that are mentioned, let me just enumerate them one by one. First is called Brahma Yajna. Brahma Yajna means offering of knowledge. And so how do we practice this yajna? Simply by studying these ancient texts. So it's study and then sharing. So learning and teaching is a part of Brahma Yajna. So this is also a form of worship So worship, again, we see how expansive the word worship means. It's not simply some rituals done in some place of a religious place. That even studying a sacred text, trying to understand its meaning, and then sharing with whoever is eager to learn what we have understood, all this is a part of worship as well. That's called Brahma Yajna. The second is called Deva Yajna, offering to the gods. But gods here is meant the deities as forces of nature, that the Vedic sages did not see the world as just a material thing, just a play of atoms and molecules. They saw that behind these material presence, there is a conscious being, there is a conscious reality. And that consciousness behind the material universe that they designated as God or Deva. Deva literally means the shining one, or shining here because of the presence of consciousness. And so the different deities they thought behind the power of water, fire, food, all these different deities that we read in the Vedic times, but really acknowledgement, it's a kind of a personification of the powers of nature. And this is practiced through ritualistic worship, through all the offerings that were done during the Vedic period. And it is done through the different forms of worship that are done even today. It's not unusual, especially it might seem a little superstitious to many today, but even in some parts of the world, definitely in parts of Asia, if there is a famine, if they need of rain, then of course you can do cloud seeding and all of that, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But there are also people who believe that doing a puja will help somehow change these universal forces and make these things possible. So sometimes if there is too much rain or too little rain or any kind of a natural calamity, people often believe that making an offering to these divine forces will help mitigate the destruction. The third kind of yajna is called Pitru Yajna. Pitru means the departed ancestors. So offerings to departed ancestors. This also is oftentimes done in the Indian subcontinent as a for making offerings. Again, can be done ritualistically, and it is done by many. But behind that ritual that is done as an offering to the departed ancestors is really a recognition of how much we owe to them. It's a form of gratitude. So it's not enough to just do some worship and say, my job is done. Worship is not some kind of a chore that needs to be completed just to avoid feeling the sense of guilt. But that worship is really a symbol of gratitude, being grateful for everything that we have inherited from our ancestors. And that gratitude should show itself that the gift that they did to us, the elders in the family, then we pass it on to the next generation. All that will come under Pitru Yajna. Bhuta Yajna means offering to pets and animals. So none of the world, as was seen, as I said, was seen as filled with consciousness. So the religiosity of these people, it was not limited to only human beings. So they saw that the same divine principle is as much present in every living creature. So avoiding cruelty to animals, especially those who are ailing, need help. So taking good care of animals as well was called Bhuta Yajna. And the final one, Nri Yajna, means making an offering to the needy and suffering. So again, what can be seen as simply social service as a form of just compassion itself can become a worship if we recognize again that same divine principle is present in every person. That's why Sri Ramakrishna said it's not just compassion that should animate our desire to serve others, but to recognize that if we truly believe that God is omnipresent, that God is everywhere, that the divine is infinite, then the divine, and then if we believe that divine is in my heart, then of course, just logically, the divine is in the heart of the person standing in front of me. There is no place, there is nothing where we cannot say God is not present there. And therefore, when we are serving someone, we are not really serving anybody because God is present everywhere. And so that service itself can be done as a form of worship. The idea of sacrifice in worship is also one's own possessiveness, because that's something even more tough. I mean, easy to do some ritualistic worship, easy to practice many of these other things. But the sense of ownership, that is one thing that keeps us tied down. So one of the sources of stress and anxiety and worry and tension and fear is the sense of ownership. And what worship can help us do is to say, I own nothing. So the sense of ownership in Sanskrit, it's called mamata. And in many, at least in many of the Vedic forms of worship, they had every offering they made, and usually it was with a big wooden ladle as offering of ghee into fire. The ancient times, there wasn't so much, hardly any image worship. They were the main form of worship in Vedic times was in fire. And so they made these offering of ghee into the fire. And every time they offered it appropriate, with chanting appropriate mantras, that this is offering to this deity, Indraya Swaha, it's an offering to Indra. And then, before making the next offering, because you see, it's in a wooden ladle, and so when you put it, not everything falls inside. Some will stick to the ladle itself. Then they'll have a small little cup by the side. So they'll put the Indraya Swaha, and then the remaining portion, a few drops of it, they'll put it in that cup and say, Idam na mama. Idam na mama means none of this is mine. And they keep on repeating it all the time. It's a form of reminding oneself that all these offerings I'm making, it's so easy to feel I'm making the offerings. And it's a way of reminding oneself, no, none of the things that I'm offering are really mine. I mentioned on other occasions how there is this among different kinds of worship that are done to different deities. One of the deities in India, their worship is the Ganges itself. The Ganges is considered one of the most sacred rivers by Hindus. And so one day in a year, some specific day, I don't remember according to lunar calendar exactly which day that is, but the river Ganges itself is worshipped. Again, not seeing it just as a body of water, but seeing that there is a divine presence behind that material entity. Now, because the Ganges is considered so sacred, in all forms of puja, people generally use that water of the Ganges because it is considered to be a purifying power it has. Now, for all worship, they use Ganges water. Now, when you worship Ganges, what water will you use? Of course, you will use Ganges water. So you are like taking water from the Ganges, and with the same water you are worshipping Ganges. And so the idea is, we cannot give to God what is not already God's. So nothing is really ours. And when we are being able to give away or surrender this idea of ownership in life, we will feel so free. Many times we feel weighed down, just the idea of not just owning material things. We think we own people. This is my family, this is my thing, this is my, that everything we say my, I mean, it just feels good to say I have all these things. But along with that, it's always a mixed blessing in some ways. While thinking that I own so much can bring so much joy, but the moment I own something or someone, it comes along with the potential fear of losing what I have. So if I possess something, any kind of an acquisition is presages a kind of certain future separation. So if things come together, at some time they are going to get separated. And so the idea here is not having a sense of ownership doesn't mean not having things or people around us. We have everything as it is. Nothing changes externally. But internally, to think this is mine, that sense of I-ness, of mineness, when it goes away, we feel a sense of freedom. Now, along with giving up this sense of possessiveness, another characteristic of worship is it's also sacrificing one's own ego to recognizing that I'm only an instrument in the hands of the divine. As ridiculous as it might seem, suppose now, when I say I lift this up, now I'm saying I lift it up, and suppose my hand were to start quarreling with me and say, you didn't lift it up, I lifted it up. Then I'll ask the hand, who are you? You don't have any identity other than me. That's essentially what it is. If this entire existence itself is nothing but the presence of the divine, then the divine is doing everything. You and I are doing nothing. So any of us saying, I'm doing this, is like my hand saying, you are not doing anything, I'm doing everything. And we say, just keep quiet. You'll just, probably God may be just having a good smile every time we feel I own something or I do something. So these are sacrifice is one of the first important characteristic of worship, offering. And we have seen many different ways that offering and sacrifice occurs. Another one characteristic of worship is adoration. In Sanskrit, it's called aradhana. And that is a practice of love and reverence. Clearly, it's not enough to just know the methodology of worship, but it must be accompanied by true love and reverence. And doing worship in the spirit in which one is expected to do it, it's easier than it becomes to develop that love and reverence, which can be one way of practicing that is through chanting of different hymns. There are these several, or reading of spiritual text as well. Music is another powerful practice, especially the singing or the chanting that we do, understanding the meaning of what is being sung, understanding the meaning of what is being chanted, helps to generate that love and reverence in the heart. There have been many, what we might say, poet saints. Many of these devotional songs that we sing were not written by just people who are just good at or wordsmiths, so to speak. That lot of these devotional songs, which have stood the test of time and for over generations people have been singing them, came from a real devotion. So many of these songs that Sri Ramakrishna sang, many of them you will find, those of you who have read it in that book, Gospel of Ramakrishna, were these great saints called Ram Prasad, Kamalakanta. They were enlightened beings. In southern part of India, there was Tyagaraja, and there are too many names to mention. But many of them, they composed all these songs, but it came through a divine inspiration. And so singing those songs or reciting their compositions is a way to purify our hearts and grow that love and reverence for the divine. Well, singing can be done individually. Singing as a collective activity, like we do the singing in the beginning and end of satsangs, that was popularized very much by Chaitanya, as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the 15th century, as a form of collective activity. That if a group of people together come and participate in any devotional activity, everyone is individually benefited because there is this the kind of a group power that is generated. Another characteristic of worship is sacredness, and that means purification or purity. Now, there are three ways we can approach this practice of purification. One is adhibhautika. Adhibhautika in Sanskrit means really physical purity. And that's why in many forms of worship that we do in Vedanta, water is so much used, and water is seen as a purifying agent. Adhidaivika, the divine counterpart of every object and every limb, and that is then that purification is achieved through many mantras. And next Sunday when we meet, I can go in a little bit more detail about how mantras are used to bring about certain purity around the place of worship and so on. And finally, Adhyatmika means spiritual purity. Now, the Atman is eternally pure, that the divine self is always pure. Now, that purity is manifested by cleansing of the mind. So, mental purity, mind itself is not the Atman, but the purification of the mind is one way the purity of the Atman is manifested through the mind. One other thing that worship does is it clarifies our relationship with God. There are various ways of relating to God. Again, as I've often said, God is a very generic term. And for many people, they may not use the word God itself, the word God, but they might see the divine in a very specific way, whichever way they have, oftentimes the different influences that have shaped our life, or the kind of symbols and ways of thinking of divine in which we grew up, all of these influence the way we try to understand the divine. But whichever way we think of the divine, it's not simply reading in a book that says, oh, God is God the Father or God the Mother. Yes, you can see that this is the way people have seen God. But ultimately, every one of us have to individually cultivate a relationship with the divine. And through puja, through worship, we ourselves maybe it will become clear to us how we are related to the divine. Because sometimes we just ask somebody out of the blue, how do you think of God? What is your relationship with God? Not everyone may be able to come up with an answer immediately because these things take time to develop. It's not an intellectual process. It's not like we sit down someday, say, I have a little free time now. How should I look upon God? It doesn't work that way. These things happen naturally. But it becomes easier to recognize how my mind relates with the divine through the practice of worship. So those are some of the characteristics of worship. What are the benefits of worship? So the first benefit, as I mentioned at the start of today's reflection, was it's a preparation for meditation. That yes, ultimately we want to remain immersed in the think of that, immersed in the presence of the divine. But that ability to remain in the presence of God, that comes through a practice of prayer and worship. And that's why straight away jumping into meditation sometimes can be not so successful. Sometimes people just go into meditation and say, oh, I tried it for a few days, it doesn't work for me, and they just give up. And a lot of time that is because we haven't really prepared ourselves for that practice. Meditation in the true sense of the term is a fairly advanced practice, and some amount of preparation is needed. And that preparation comes through the practice of prayer and worship. So those who have done prayer sincerely, even if it's not perfectly, but sincerely, and those who have tried to do worship, again, we will see next Sunday, it may not be We don't have to be experts at all these worship, because many times we might say, I would like to do it, but I don't know how to do it. It's possible for every one of us to do it. Uh, through prayer, through worship, we become then fit enough to then practice meditation. So those who have attempted meditation after doing some amount of prayer and worship, they have found much greater success at doing meditation, and that practice having a truly transformative effect on our life. The second thing it does, benefit of worship, is that it, as I briefly mentioned, it strengthens our relationship with God. Not only does it clarify for us how we are related to God, but it even strengthens it. Sri Ramakrishna says in his conversations in the Gospel, he says, but the bhaktas say the whole universe is the glory of God. Suppose the king is seated in his court and his cook enters the hall, sits on the throne and says, O king, you and I are same. People will certainly call him a madman. But suppose one day the king, pleased with the cook's service, says to him, come, sit beside me. There is nothing wrong in that. There is no difference between you and me. Then, if the cook sits on the throne with the king, there is no harm in it. It is not good for ordinary people to say, I am he. The waves belong to the water. Does the water belong to the waves? Again, I would like to caution a little bit the popularity of non-duality and infinite consciousness. It's very much in the air, and it's intellectually very satisfying. Even though it may be very intellectually satisfying, we have to be pragmatic in the sense to ask ourselves, just because I seem to understand and appreciate a concept, has it really changed me as a person? I may be able to talk about it eloquently. It might somehow make me bring some amount of intellectual satisfaction. But has it really changed me? What about the fear, the stress, the anxiety, the worries, the natural tendency to only consider one's own self-interest in everything? All of these things, if all my talk about non-duality and consciousness hasn't changed that, then it's pointless. And so what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here is that it becomes so much more easy to, in the beginning, to not immediately say, well, I'm the infinite one. Well, one can say it, and people are already saying it. But if just saying I'm the infinite one and going through my life the rest of the time as if I'm this mortal little being to get this sense of ownership and everything, merely saying I'm the infinite one doesn't really do much. It's so much better that if one proceeds through this path of prayer and worship, and then recognizes one's relationship with God, the more God comes closer to our heart. And that's what he says, that at that point, God alone would say, you are not this little one, come and sit near me, you and I are the same. When that you and I are the same comes from the divine, that is much more effective, much more powerful than we, without any preparation, say, oh, I don't believe in any God, I am the infinite one. Doesn't help much in practice. In the beginning, for many of us, when we come to spiritual life, God is a stranger. And therefore, in worship, oftentimes God becomes a divine guest, so to speak. We have different kinds of guests. There are people we know, people who we look forward to, but sometimes somebody may just show up. Today, of course, if somebody shows up like that, people may not even open their doors or call 911. But in the Vedic period, these people who you don't know, who just show up unannounced, they were called atithis. Tithi means one who has an appointment, some fixed time. Atithi means without any appointment, simply shows up. And as I said, today people will not open the door if strangers come. But times have changed. In ancient times, people saw every person, especially if someone just shows up, maybe God has come in that form. In fact, in many Orthodox households, whenever there are four members of the family, when they set the table, they'll have five plates there in case somebody shows up. And so, in the beginning, God is a kind of a stranger. And a lot of the worship that is done, and again, we'll see more details next week, is really the kind of the welcome that was given to honored guests in ancient times. So a lot of the rituals involved are really kind of treating the divine as a guest. And of course, we know guests, if they overstay, then they no longer get that kind of an honorable this thing. But God as a guest, that's already a bit transformation. Rather than a total stranger, God becomes an honored guest. And as long as God remains an honored guest in our mental makeup, then we might observe certain festivals, certain special days in a year when the divine comes and we do the worship. But soon enough, when that stranger, God as a stranger disappears, God is no longer seen as a guest. Because if God comes to our home, why would we want to say, God, okay, bye now, come again after 2 months? A devotee will say, God, you have come here now, don't go. Just stay with us, be a part of the family. And that way then, a devotee, a bhakta says, this is my home, is not my home. It's really the divine place. And I'm only a tenant here, staying here through God's grace. And then worship then becomes at least once a day, a daily thing. Because if God is present in my home, staying as one of the residents in my home, then I need to acknowledge God's presence through an act of worship. So in many homes, they might have a small shrine, and they do a small worship every day, again acknowledging that God is now a part of the family. One other benefit of worship is that it purifies the mind. And that is done when devotees accept everything as a gift from God and then sharing it with other people. As I said, the sense of ownership goes away. That doesn't mean things don't come to us. Things do come. But rather than seeing them in an egoistic sort of way, oh, I worked hard and I got this, a devotee will say, it came to me through God's grace. But what about the hard work I put in? Even that energy and wisdom that I had to work hard, even that came through God's grace. So the moment we truly, not just verbally, truly learn to see everything as an act of grace, life will change for us. These are the primary benefits of worship. The secondary benefits are the sanctification of, we might say, of many social institutions such as marriage and other sacraments in life. That whenever these are accompanied by some religious ritual or some form of worship, they get sanctified. So that sanctification of social institutions occurs. Also, it contributes towards social cohesion through forming of social communities. We know that there's much that can be said about this, but sometimes just being by ourselves can be daunting in some ways when you have these big outward forces outside of us. But then being part of a community gives us this added strength that I'm not just this one person, but there is this whole. And the community in which we are born actually is the family. But besides our own family, the parts of the places of worship that we often go to, or certain other groups that we are a part of. Being a part of a larger group gives us an added sense of strength and help in life. And finally, worship does provide us a sense of security and well-being. Many people have experienced that participating in a worship or doing worship oneself both does help in feeling secure and happy. And so these are some of the benefits, both individually and socially, that people have experienced. So today we saw very briefly the primary characteristics of worship, what the benefits of worship are. And when we meet next Sunday, we will see what the basic laws that govern any form of worship and a brief structure of the worship that we do at the Vedanta Society. So that next time you participate in a puja here, you will be able to appreciate it and benefit it in a greater way. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu.